She had conquered boardrooms, launched a billion-dollar company from a one-bedroom apartment, and been named one of the most powerful women in tech before the age of 30. Then one rainy Tuesday night, a car ran a red light and changed everything. Now she sat in a wheelchair on the 52nd floor watching her empire crumble, while the man who would save her life pushed a mop down the hallway outside her door, and nobody noticed him at all. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now, drop your city in the comments below, and let me know where in the world you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in, because this one is going to take you somewhere. The elevator opened onto the 52nd floor at 11:47 on a Wednesday night, and Ethan Cross stepped out with a mop bucket, a clipboard, and the particular brand of exhaustion that doesn't come from working too hard but from working too long without anyone noticing that you exist. He was 32 years old. He had a 7-year-old son named Noah at home asleep under a dinosaur blanket, a landlord who had already called twice about rent that was 11 days late, and a pair of work boots with a hole in the left sole that he'd been plugging with doubled-up socks since October. He had a thermos of cold coffee clipped to the side of his bucket because the break room microwave had been broken since February and nobody had gotten around to fixing it. He had a bruise on his right forearm from where the service elevator door had caught him yesterday because the sensor was also broken, and nobody had gotten around to fixing that either. He had exactly none of the things that made other people stop and pay attention. What he did have was a methodical approach to the floors of the Hale Tower that had earned him a reputation among the night cleaning crew as the one guy you could count on to do the job right. He started at the elevator bank, worked counterclockwise, finished at the stairwells. He checked the corners that other guys skipped because they figured nobody looked there. He didn't rush because rushing meant missing things, and missing things meant complaints. And complaints meant the kind of conversation with facilities management that he didn't have the energy for. The 52nd floor was technically a single residential unit, a full-floor penthouse that occupied the entire top level of the building, because the building had originally been designed with commercial floors below and a private residence above. And the person who'd had the money and the vision to buy the whole thing had turned the penthouse into something that existed in a category that didn't have a normal word for it. It wasn't just an apartment. It wasn't quite a home. It was a statement that had stopped being a statement after the accident. Ethan ran his mop through the corridor that connected the elevator lobby to the main entrance of the penthouse, the stretch of polished concrete that the cleaning crew was responsible for since it technically fell outside the residential unit's footprint. He worked in the low hum of the building's HVAC system and the distant sound of the city 47 stories below. At this hour, the floor was always quiet. He'd been on this rotation for 3 months, and in that time he'd never once seen the lights on inside the penthouse when he came through. Tonight, they were on. Not bright. Not the kind of lights that meant a party or a late dinner or any of the things that the previous tenant had been known for. Just a thin line of yellow visible beneath the main door. The kind of light that meant somebody was awake in one room with everything else dark around them. Ethan noted it. He didn't investigate. It wasn't his business, and he'd been very clear with himself since taking this job about the things that were his business and the things that weren't. He mopped the corridor. He wiped down the elevator panel. He checked the emergency exit signs at both ends of the floor, initialed the log sheet, and was heading back to the elevator when he heard the crash. It came from inside the penthouse, a heavy, resonant impact, something substantial hitting the floor, followed by a silence that felt different from the silence before it. A charged silence, the kind that made the hairs on the back of his arm go up without him quite understanding why. He stood still for a moment. It wasn't his business. Then he heard the second sound, and this one was harder to ignore. A single, sharp, involuntary sound. Not a scream. Just the sound a person makes when they've been hurt, and they're alone, and they don't want to make noise, but the noise comes out anyway. Ethan knocked on the door. Nothing. He knocked again, louder. Building maintenance. I heard something. You okay in there? Silence. He tried the door handle on instinct, and it gave, unlocked, and he pushed it open about 6 inches and said, louder now, "Ma'am? Sir? I'm coming in to check. I just heard a crash." He pushed the door fully open. The penthouse entry opened into a long gallery-style corridor lit by low sconces. The walls hung with framed photographs and one long abstract painting in colors that looked expensive even in dim light. The corridor opened at the far end into a living space that was large enough to have its own architectural logic. Floor-to-ceiling windows on three sides, the city spread out below like a second sky, and the room itself arranged around a low conversation pit and a fireplace that wasn't running. On the floor beside an overturned side table was a woman. She was on her side, one arm braced against the floor, her dark hair loose around her face. The wheelchair was tipped on its side 3 feet away from her, one wheel still slowly spinning. A glass had shattered. That was the first sound, probably. And the contents, water or something else, were spread across the floor in a rough fan shape. She didn't look up right away. When she did, her expression wasn't frightened. It was furious. "Get out," she said. Ethan didn't get out. He crossed the room in the time it took her to register that he wasn't moving, set his clipboard on the side table that was still standing, and crouched down to right the wheelchair first without touching her, getting it upright and locked so it would be there when she needed it. "I said get out." Her voice was controlled in the way that suggested the effort behind it. "I don't need help. I was getting up." "Okay," Ethan said. "Then why are you still here?" "Because the floor's wet and there's broken glass, and you were on your side when I came in." He stayed crouched at her level, not looming, not reaching for her. "I'm not going to pick you up unless you want me to, but I'm not going to leave until I know you're not hurt." She stared at him. She had striking features, angular jaw, dark eyes that in this light looked almost black. The kind of face that would read well on a magazine cover, and was currently expressing something close to contempt. She was younger than he'd expected. 30, maybe. Young to be living alone in a place like this. Young to have the kind of stillness in her face that usually took decades of disappointment to develop. "Who are you?" she asked. "Ethan Cross, night cleaning crew." "You clean floors." "Among other things." She said nothing for a moment. Then she pushed herself up onto both arms and worked herself toward the wheelchair with the practiced, grinding efficiency of someone who'd done this before and hated every second of it. She didn't ask for help, and he didn't offer it. When she'd gotten herself up and into the seat, breathing hard and not looking at him, he picked up the broken glass with his bare hands. Not smart, but fast. And set the pieces on the tipped table, and then he righted the table too. "You're bleeding," she said. He looked at his palm. A small cut from the glass, not deep. "I'm fine." "There are bandages in the kitchen cabinet, second shelf." She paused. "You might as well use one." He found the kitchen, found the cabinet, found a bandage. The kitchen was large and almost aggressively unused, a professional range that had probably never seen a pan, a refrigerator stocked with protein drinks and takeout containers, a coffee machine that looked like it cost more than Ethan's car. He put the bandage on his palm and came back. She had wheeled herself to the windows. She was looking out at the city the way people look at things they're trying not to think too hard about. "What were you reaching for?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Then she gestured toward the side table. On the floor beneath it, half under the table skirt, was a small framed photograph. He picked it up. A woman, younger, standing in what looked like a rooftop setting with a skyline behind her, laughing at whoever was holding the camera. He recognized the face but couldn't place where from. "That's me," she said, and her voice was flat enough that he knew she'd had to work to make it that flat. 3 years ago. He looked at the photograph. He looked at her. He put the photograph on the table. "Victoria Hale," he said, because he'd placed it now. He'd seen the name on the directory in the building lobby, seen the logo on the building itself, seen the face in passing somewhere, a news article or a tech blog that he'd scrolled past. "You started Hale Technologies." "I used to run it." She turned the wheelchair slightly. "Now I sit here and watch other people run it into the ground." She said it with a precision that made it sound like a fact she'd recited so many times it had stopped hurting and started just being true. "You should go. You have floors to clean." "I do," he agreed. He didn't go. She looked at him. "Is there something else?" "How long have you been in the chair?" Her expression shifted, a flicker of something that wasn't quite anger. "That's not a question a janitor asks a tenant." "No," he said. "It's a question I'm asking." The distinction landed. She studied him for a long moment with those dark eyes that had clearly spent a lot of time evaluating people and not finding them particularly interesting. 8 months, she finally said. Car accident, spinal contusion, T6 level. The surgeons say there's maybe 15% residual nerve function below the injury. The physiatrist I stopped seeing 6 weeks ago said I should focus on adaptation strategies and learn to be comfortable with my limitations. She said this last part with a flatness that contained about 9 different emotions packed down until they barely fit. What do you say? Ethan asked. I say I threw him out of this penthouse. Something that was almost a smile crossed his face. Did he go quietly? Not particularly. Good. He looked at her. Has anyone tested the nerve function recently, since the initial assessments? She frowned. What do you know about nerve function assessments? Enough to ask the question. You're a janitor. Tonight I am. He said it simply, without defensiveness. Has anyone retested it in the last 8 months? I told you I stopped treatment. I heard you. Has anyone retested it? She stared at him. No. Then nobody knows what's actually there. He straightened up, picked up his clipboard from the side table. The kind of injury you're describing, T6 contusion rather than complete severance, the nerve pathway doesn't just close. It goes dormant. It atrophies. But it doesn't always close. He paused. I've seen people at 30% function learn to walk again. I've seen people at less. The room was very quiet. Victoria Hale looked at him the way someone looks at a person who's just said something that could either be the truest thing they've ever heard or the cruelest. You're telling me I can walk again? Her voice was carefully expressionless. I'm telling you I don't know yet, but the fact that nobody's checked recently means nobody knows. And you, a janitor, are going to figure that out. I'm going to help you figure it out. She laughed. It was a short, involuntary sound. Not warm, not cruel, something in between. The laugh of a person who's reached the outer edge of what they can take and found something absurd waiting for them there. Her eyes were wet, and she didn't blink, and she didn't look away from him. That, she said, is the most ridiculous thing anyone has said to me in 8 months. I know. You should leave. I will. He picked up his mop bucket from the doorway where he'd left it. I'm on this floor every Wednesday and Friday nights, same time. He didn't make it a question or an offer. He just said it like a piece of information she might want to have. The glass is going to need a proper cleanup. There are probably small pieces you can't see. I'll come back in the morning if that's better. I didn't say you could come back. No, he said. You didn't. He went back to the elevator. He finished the floor, checked the stairwells, initialed the log sheet, and rode the service elevator down to the B2 level where the cleaning crew kept their equipment. His partner that night, a 58-year-old Haitian man named Gerald, who'd been working the building since before the ownership changed hands, was refilling his solution tank when Ethan came in. 52 quiet? Gerald asked. Quiet enough? Ethan said. Gerald nodded and went back to his tank. That was the thing about this job. Nobody needed to know more than what the floor required, and that suited Ethan fine. He'd been cultivating a life that didn't require explanations for going on 4 years now, and he'd gotten reasonably good at it. He clocked out at 1:15 a.m. He drove home in the 6-year-old Honda Civic that had 3 years of payments left on it, parked on the street outside his apartment building on Meridian, and let himself in quietly because the neighbors had a light sleeper on the other side of the wall. Noah was asleep exactly where Ethan had left him. On his side, one hand tucked under his cheek, the dinosaur blanket twisted around his middle the way it always was by this point in the night. Ethan stood in the doorway for a moment in the dark, watching his son breathe. Noah was 7 years old and already had his mother's jaw and his mother's way of tilting his head when he was thinking something through. He was in 2nd grade. He liked anything with wheels, cars, trucks, skateboards, the shopping cart at the grocery store. He'd recently become interested in insects in the intense, complete way that 7-year-olds become interested in things, and there was currently a jar on the windowsill that purportedly contained a chrysalis, though Ethan had not seen evidence of life in it for 2 weeks. He was the kind of kid who made friends easily and kept them, who told the truth even when it cost him something, who still occasionally climbed into Ethan's bed at 3 in the morning and didn't say anything, just brought his blanket and curled up and went back to sleep. His mother, Claire, had walked out when Noah was 3. Not violently, not dramatically, just quietly, and with a kind of certainty that suggested she'd been working up to it for longer than Ethan had understood at the time. She sent money occasionally and a birthday card every year, and asked about Noah in texts that Ethan answered carefully and without editorializing, and that was the shape of that. Ethan closed Noah's door and sat down at the kitchen table with his cold coffee and his bandaged palm and thought about Victoria Hale on the floor of her 52-story penthouse, reaching for a photograph of herself standing up. He thought about what he'd seen in her, the way he'd trained himself, years ago in a different context entirely, to read the shape of an injury before a chart told you what it was. He thought about what her physiatrist had said about adaptation strategies, and what that usually meant in practice. It meant giving up while maintaining the clinical vocabulary of progress. He'd seen it happen to soldiers who deserved better. He pulled out his phone and opened the Notes app and started writing. He'd been a military rehabilitation specialist for 6 years before he'd become a janitor, which was not a sentence that told the story correctly, but was factually accurate. What it left out was the 6 months between, and what those 6 months had cost him, and why he'd ended up here rather than anywhere the degree and the field experience should have led. He'd graduated from his program at 23 and been commissioned as a rehabilitation officer with a track record that caught the attention of the kind of people who track attention. He'd worked with combat-injured soldiers at 2 different facilities, and he'd been good at it. Not good in the way that meant technically proficient, though he was that too, but good in the specific way that meant the patients who came to him with no hope had a different ratio of outcomes than the averages suggested they should. His unit commanders noticed. He was commended. He built a reputation. And then he met his program director, a man named Dr. Lorne Ashford, who had been running the facility's rehabilitation program for 11 years and had a philosophy about what recovery looked like and what it was reasonable to expect from patients who presented with certain levels of injury. Ashford's philosophy, which he never stated directly but which operated through every resource allocation decision he made, was that high-functioning recoveries made the program look good and justified continued funding, and patients who were unlikely to achieve high-functioning recoveries were better served by redirection toward quality-of-life programming, which was a medical way of saying, write some of them off so the numbers on the others look better. Ethan had a patient, Corporal Marcus Webb, 26, spinal injury at L3, deemed by Ashford's assessment criteria to be a low-probability, high-function candidate. And he'd worked with Marcus anyway, on his own time, outside the official programming, because he'd seen something in Marcus's nerve response patterns that the initial assessment had missed. He'd kept his own records. He'd documented the progress. Marcus Webb walked out of the facility 9 months later. Ashford had Ethan terminated inside a month. The grounds were procedural, unauthorized modification of treatment protocols, documentation irregularities, patient contact outside approved programming hours. None of it was wrong, technically. The spirit of it was that Ethan had embarrassed the program by being right in a way that required everyone to notice that Ashford had been wrong, and the program ran on Ashford's authority. He'd contested it. He'd filed the paperwork. He'd consulted with a veterans advocacy organization that told him his chances were real, but his timeline was long, and in the meantime, he had a kid who needed to eat and a lease that needed paying. He'd taken the first job that would have him, and had spent the subsequent time doing the work he could do while the appeal sat in whatever administrative queue appeals sat in. It had been 16 months now. He'd stopped checking the status every day. He checked it on Sundays. The point was, he knew what he was looking at when he looked at Victoria Hale. He knew what 8 months of abandoned physical therapy did to nerve pathways that might still have had something to offer. He knew what it looked like when a person had been given someone else's ceiling instead of their own. He also knew, because he'd made this mistake once before with Marcus Webb, the mistake of certainty before proof, that he didn't know yet. He'd said that to her honestly. T6 contusion was not the same as L3. The margins were different. The probability curves were different, but nobody had checked, and that fact sat in his chest and wouldn't let go. He finished his notes and went to sleep. Woke. He was back on Friday at the same time. He had half expected the floor to be dark, but the lights were on again beneath the door. He had not called ahead because he didn't have her number, and he hadn't tried to get it through the building's tenant directory because that seemed like the wrong way to approach this. He knocked. She answered faster than he'd expected, which meant she'd heard the elevator. "You actually came back," she said. "I said I was on this floor Wednesdays and Fridays. People say a lot of things." He looked at her. In the daylight, or near daylight, the penthouse was lit properly now, the sconces supplemented by recessed ceiling fixtures that made the space feel less like a vigil. She looked different, more defined. The first time he'd seen her, she'd been on the floor, and then in the dim of the windows, and he hadn't had a full picture. Now he did. She was wearing a plain gray long-sleeve shirt and dark pants. She'd pulled her hair back. She looked like someone who'd been trying to work. There was a laptop open on the desk across the room, papers beside it, a coffee cup that had probably been full 2 hours ago. She looked like someone who'd been trying to work and had been unable to concentrate, which was a specific kind of exhausted that Ethan recognized. "Are you going to invite me in?" he said, "or are we doing this in the doorway?" She considered this. Then she backed the wheelchair up and let him in. "I looked you up," she said when they were inside. She said it in a way that was neither apologetic nor aggressive, just informational, the way someone with her resources and her habits would naturally approach an unknown variable. Ethan Cross, military rehabilitation specialist, decommissioned 16 months ago following an administrative review. Before that, 6 years at the Hargrove Veterans Rehabilitation Center, secondary posting at Fort Dawes. Commendations in 2018 and 2021. She paused. Marcus Webb, corporal, treated under your protocols, currently coaches adaptive athletics at a rec center in Sacramento. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "You're thorough. I didn't get where I got by taking things on faith." She turned the wheelchair slightly, a habit he was starting to recognize. She moved it when she was processing something, small adjustments that were probably reflexive. "Why are you cleaning floors?" "Because no one needs to eat, and the appeal takes time." "You're appealing the termination." "Yes." "With what result?" "Unknown, as of last Sunday." She looked at him steadily. "And while you wait, you mop floors and approach paralyzed women who fall out of their wheelchairs." "I approach people I think I can help," he said. "The floors are separate." "You think you can help me?" "I think nobody has checked what's actually there since the injury, and I think that's a serious gap. And I think you know it's a serious gap, or you wouldn't still be awake at midnight reaching for photographs." The room was quiet. She looked at the window instead of him. Outside, the city went on being the city, lit and moving and utterly indifferent in the way that cities are to the specific weight of the things happening inside the buildings they contain. "What would you need," she said finally, "to assess what's actually there?" "About 40 minutes and your cooperation." Define cooperation. Honesty about sensation, tolerance for some discomfort, no deciding in advance what I'm going to find. She turned back to face him. "And if you find nothing, then I'll tell you that." Without softening it. Without softening it. She studied him for a long moment. He didn't fill the silence. He'd learned, from years of working with people who'd been catastrophically hurt and needed something real more than something comfortable, that the silence was often where the actual decision happened, and the only thing you could do with it was not panic and not rush. 40 minutes, she said. He assessed her carefully and without false confidence, moving through the established protocol, dermatome mapping, reflex testing, voluntary motor response at each level. He asked questions, and she answered them with the flat precision of someone who'd been through this before, and hated the patronizing overlay that usually came with medical assessment. He didn't give her the patronizing overlay. He treated her like someone with information he needed, which she was. At the end of 40 minutes, he sat back and was quiet for a moment. "Well," she said. "There's something there," he said. "It's faint and it's inconsistent, which is typical at this stage with a contusion injury that's been dormant, but it's there." He looked at her. "Your previous physiatrist tested 8 months ago. He tested at 6 months, 2 months after the injury. At 6 months, the dormancy pattern would have looked like absence. They probably wrote it off as scar tissue effect." He paused. "It's not scar tissue." She didn't say anything for a long moment. He watched her face do something complicated that she was working hard to contain. "What does that mean?" she said. Specifically, it means there's a pathway. Degraded, undersupported, compressed from 8 months of disuse, but a pathway. He chose his next words carefully because this was the part where the cruelty was in false hope, and the cruelty was also an unnecessary restraint, and the line between them was where he had to live. I can't promise you walking. I want to be clear about that. What I can promise you is that the pathway you have right now is not the ceiling. And if we work consistently, really work, not the kind of therapeutic movement that's designed to make you feel like you're doing something, I think we find out what the actual ceiling is. What does consistent work look like? Every day. Some days more painful than others. A lot of resistance from your own nervous system, especially in the early weeks, because the pathways will fight the reactivation before they cooperate with it. There will be stretches where nothing seems to be happening and you'll want to stop. He paused. That's when it matters most that you don't. She looked at him. You're describing months. Probably. You clean floors 3 nights a week. I have mornings free. I'm not a charity case. I'm not offering charity. He met her eyes. I'm offering what I know how to do. What you do with it is up to you. She looked out at the city for a long moment. He sat with it. My board of directors, she said, is currently building a case to have me removed as CEO. They've been building it for 4 months. They haven't announced it yet because they're waiting for the right procedural moment. She said this with a kind of controlled bitterness that suggested she'd been carrying it for a long time. The argument they're preparing is that my disability makes me incapable of effective leadership, which is not only wrong but is almost certainly not legal. But the legal process takes time I may not have, and while it's pending, the company I built with 9 years of my life is being quietly dismantled by people I used to trust. Ethan was quiet. I'm telling you this, she continued, because I want you to understand what this building is and what it represents, and why I don't accept help from people I don't understand. She turned back to face him. I understand you now, or the outline of you. You were good at your job, you were right about something your superior didn't want you to be right about, and you got cut for it, and now you're waiting and cleaning floors and trying not to lose forward momentum while the system decides whether it wants to acknowledge that you exist. She paused. I know what that feels like. I figured you might, he said. If we do this, if I agree to let you work with me on this, I need to know that you're not doing it because you feel sorry for me. I told you Wednesday. I don't feel sorry for you. Tell me again. I don't feel sorry for you, Victoria. He said her name without making it a big deal, just used it because it was her name. I think you've been given a ceiling that belongs to someone else's limitations, and that bothers me. Not because I feel sorry for you, because I've seen it before and I know what it costs. The room was quiet again. Mornings, she said finally, starting Monday, 7 a.m. 7 a.m. works. And don't be late. I have conference calls starting at 9 and I need time to prepare. I won't be late. And Ethan, she said his name the same way he'd said hers. Just a name, not a ceremony. Don't tell me things are going to be fine. Don't do the thing where you keep the bad information from me to protect my feelings. If it's bad, I need to know it's bad. That's the only way I know how to work, he said. She nodded once. She turned back to the window. He picked up his clipboard. He let himself out. In the corridor, waiting for the elevator, he exhaled slowly and looked down at his bandaged palm. The small cut that had been his way into a room he hadn't been invited to, and a life he hadn't expected to intersect with his own. The elevator came. He stepped in. Noah would be up in 5 hours demanding pancakes and wanting to know if the chrysalis had done anything yet. Ethan would have to tell him no, not yet. But that didn't mean nothing was happening. Sometimes the change was invisible, right up until the moment it wasn't. He rode the elevator down through 52 floors of the city's vertical ambition, and at the bottom he stepped out into the parking structure and walked to his car with the particular feeling of a man who has just made a promise he intends to keep. Monday came the way Monday always came, without ceremony, without adjustment for the things that had changed over the weekend. Ethan was at the 52nd floor elevator at 6:58 a.m. with a backpack instead of a mop bucket, wearing his regular clothes, and the difference felt strange in a way he hadn't fully anticipated. He'd been in this building 3 nights a week for 3 months, and the uniform and the equipment had always functioned as a kind of social contract. They told everyone around him exactly what he was and what he was for, and that clarity, whatever it cost him in terms of how people looked at him, had also been a kind of protection. Without it, he was just a man standing in a corridor. Victoria opened the door before he knocked. She'd been up for a while, coffee already made, laptop open, hair pulled back. She was dressed practically, in fitted athletic pants and a long-sleeve shirt, which told him she'd thought about this more than she would probably admit. "You're 2 minutes early," she said. "I said I wouldn't be late." Early is its own form of pressure. But she backed the wheelchair up and let him in, and that was what mattered. The living space looked different in morning light. Less like a vigil, more like a place where someone actually lived or was trying to. He'd brought a foam mat, a set of resistance bands, and a notebook. He set them on the floor and didn't make any speech about it. "We're going to start with something that will feel pointless," he said. "I want to be upfront about that. The first 2 weeks are going to feel like nothing is happening, and that's actually the point. We're waking up tissue that's been dormant for 8 months. It's not going to feel like progress. It's going to feel like a very boring waste of time." Victoria looked at the foam mat on her floor. "That's your opening pitch." "I don't do pitches, I do accurate previews." "Fine." She wheeled herself closer to the mat. "Show me what pointless looks like." What it looked like, in practice, was this. Ethan positioned himself on the floor beside her chair, guided her through a series of very slow, very deliberate weight shifts. Pressure applied through her hips, through the base of her spine, down toward nerve roots that hadn't received intentional stimulus in months. He talked her through the mechanics without talking down to her. He asked her to describe sensation in precise terms, not just yes or no, but quality and location, and whether it was consistent or variable. She was, he quickly discovered, extremely good at this. She had a precision of language that came from years of technical communication, and she applied it to describing what her body was doing, or not doing, with the same exactness she probably used in engineering briefs. "No, I think I maybe felt something." She'd say, "There's a pressure response at the left hip. It doesn't extend downward. It feels like it stops around the iliac crest." That was useful. That was exactly the kind of information he needed. What she was not good at was patience with the pace of it. 20 minutes in, she said, "This isn't doing anything." "Not yet." "I don't feel anything different." "You're not supposed to yet." "Then what's the point of—" "Victoria." He kept his voice even. "I know this feels like nothing. That's because the first stage of this is below the threshold of perception. The neural signal we're trying to reestablish starts at a level you can't feel yet. If you could feel it, we'd already be past this stage." He paused. "This is the part most people skip because it doesn't feel like progress and it's boring and uncomfortable. This is also the part that determines whether anything else is possible." She was quiet for a moment. She was gripping the armrests of the wheelchair. Not hard, but her knuckles were visible. He recognized that grip. He'd seen it on Marcus Webb, on a dozen others. It was the grip of someone fighting the urge to stand up and walk out of a process they didn't trust yet. "How do you know it will work?" she said. "Not in general, specifically me." "How do you know?" "I don't," he said. "I know the pathway exists. I know 8 months of dormancy doesn't close it. I know that the response patterns I saw on Friday are consistent with recoverable function." He kept his eyes on the work, adjusting the pressure at her left hip, watching her face for the involuntary response that would tell him something her words wouldn't. "But I told you Friday, and I'll tell you again. I can't promise you the outcome. I can only promise you the work." "That's not very comforting." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She looked at him. Something in her face shifted. Not softening exactly, more like a recalibration. She loosened her grip on the armrest slightly. "Fine, keep going. Sab." The first week was exactly what he'd told her it would be. Boring, uncomfortable, and visibly productionless. They worked for 90 minutes each morning, and when he left at 8:30 to get Noah up and fed and on the school bus, she'd get back in her wheelchair and conduct her 9 o'clock call looking no different than she had the day before. He knew she was skeptical. She didn't hide it particularly. She was the kind of person whose skepticism operated as a baseline condition, not a special response to special circumstances. But she showed up every morning at 7, and she did the work without cutting corners. And when he asked her to describe sensation, she described it accurately, even when the honest answer was nothing. On Thursday of the first week, that changed. He had her in a supported standing position, weight bars on either side, his hands at her hips guiding the distribution. And he was watching her face when she went very still. "Stop," she said. He stopped moving. "What do you feel?" She was quiet for a moment. Her eyes were focused on the middle distance in a way that meant she was concentrating entirely on internal information. "There's something. Left side, below the hip, it's..." She stopped. "It's gone." But it was there. For maybe 2 seconds. What did it feel like? She thought about it. Pressure, like someone pressed their thumb against the inside of my leg, from inside. She looked at him. "Is that..." "Yes," he said. "That's exactly what we're looking for." She didn't react the way he might have expected. No tears, no sudden hope. She looked at the middle distance again with an expression that was cautious and slightly combative, like someone who's been given a piece of good news and is waiting for the catch. "It was 2 seconds," she said. 2 seconds is a beginning. Don't make it into more than it is." "I'm not," he said. 2 seconds today is still 2 seconds more than yesterday." "That's not poetry. That's just the data." She was quiet for a moment. "Fine," she said. Then, "Can we go again?" What he hadn't accounted for, not because he'd been naive about it, but because some things don't fully compute until they're in front of you, was Noah. Noah had started asking questions about where Ethan went in the mornings. He was 7, and he was perceptive the way 7-year-olds could be when they'd spent a lot of time in a household that was just 2 people, and he'd noticed that his dad was leaving earlier than usual and coming back with a different kind of tired than the cleaning floor's tired. "Are you getting a new job?" Noah asked on the Thursday morning, eating cereal with the focused attention he gave most meals. "Not yet," Ethan said. "I'm helping someone." "Who?" "A woman named Victoria. She was hurt and she's trying to get better." Noah processed this. "Is she nice?" Ethan thought about it honestly. "She's direct," he said. "That's different from nice, but it's not the same as mean." Noah considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Is she going to be okay?" "I think so. We're working on it." "Can I meet her?" "Probably not yet." "How come?" "Because she doesn't really know many people right now, and that's something she's working through too." He paused. "Give it time." Noah accepted this and went back to his cereal, and Ethan thought about the fact that the only 2 people in his life who were currently making him feel like he was going in the right direction were a 7-year-old who asked straightforward questions and a CEO who didn't tolerate evasion, and that both of them required the exact same thing from him: honesty without softening. He could work with that. The second week shifted. Not dramatically. There was no single moment that changed everything. No morning when Victoria suddenly stood up and took a step and the world rearranged itself. It was subtler than that and more real than that. The 2-second pressure sensation became 5 seconds, and then inconsistent, some days present, some days not. And then, by the end of the second week, reliably present on the left side with occasional flickers on the right. The flickers on the right were significant, and he told her so. What she started doing, somewhere around day 9 or 10, was working on her own between their sessions. He knew because she'd report small observations when he arrived. "I tried the hip weight shift last night the way you showed me, and I got the left side sensation again." And because he could see the difference in the tissue responsiveness during their morning sessions. She was doing the work on her own time without being asked. He didn't comment on it directly, he just incorporated it. What he also noticed, and said nothing about because it wasn't his business, was that she was getting up earlier. When he arrived at 7, she'd been awake long enough to have made coffee and reviewed her emails, and sometimes to have already drafted something on her laptop. The woman who'd been awake at midnight reaching for a photograph on a darkened floor was now awake at 5:30 doing the work of running a company that was trying to run her out. He didn't know the full shape of the board situation. She hadn't elaborated on it past what she'd told him Friday, and he hadn't asked. But he could see it operating in the periphery of their sessions. The phone that buzzed during their work, and that she silenced without looking at. The tightness around her eyes some mornings that hadn't been there the day before. The way she'd occasionally go somewhere else in the middle of an exercise, and he'd have to say her name to bring her back. One morning, about 12 days in, she came out of a hip extension hold and said, without preamble, "They're moving the vote to next month." Ethan held the position steady. "I thought you said they were waiting for the right procedural moment." "They found it. Our quarterly review is in 6 weeks. They're going to call an emergency governance meeting the week before, ostensibly to review leadership continuity protocols and use it to push a vote on my role." She said this with the flat precision of someone who'd gotten this information in writing and read it 3 times before they could speak about it calmly. "My general counsel says I have standing to challenge the procedure, but not the vote itself, if they can show cause." Can they show cause? They're building one. Performance metrics, missed engagements, accessibility concerns. She said the last 2 words with a specific kind of bitterness. Accessibility concerns. As if the fact that I conduct my board calls from a wheelchair instead of a conference room table is a meaningful indicator of capacity. Ethan thought about this. What would challenge it look like? Showing up. Physically. Not by video, not by proxy. Walking into that room and conducting myself as the person who built this company. She paused. Not rolling in. Walking in. That's 6 weeks. I know. We've had 2 weeks. We have nerve response on one side with intermittent response on the other. We're not close to it. I know, she said, and something in her voice stopped him. Not desperation. Something more controlled than that. A calculation she'd been running privately and had now decided to put on the table. I know what 6 weeks means given where we are. I'm not asking you to promise me anything. I'm asking you to tell me what I need to do to make it the best possible chance. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the timeline honestly, the way he'd trained himself to look at things, without false hope and without unnecessary pessimism, just the actual data laid over the actual time available. We'd need to move faster than I'd normally push, he said. It would mean more pain than we've been dealing with. Some of what I'm going to ask you to do in the next few weeks is going to feel like your body is fighting you, because it will be. The nervous system resists this kind of reactivation. It's not comfortable, and there's no way to make it comfortable. We'd also need to adjust your schedule to give me 2 sessions a day instead of 1. Fine. Victoria, I mean real pain, not discomfort. I understand what pain means, she said. I've been in this chair for 8 months. I know what my body can handle. He looked at her. Do you want to think about it? I've been thinking about it for 2 weeks, she said. I've been thinking about it since the first day you showed up here. I didn't get to where I got by being afraid of something hard. She met his eyes. Tell me what to do, Chad. He restructured the program that night after Noah was asleep, sitting at the kitchen table with his notes and his phone and the specific focused attention of a man who is doing the thing he was trained to do and knows it. The accelerated protocol was not something he was inventing. It was a framework he'd developed at Hargrove, tested and refined over 3 years of working with soldiers whose timelines had also been compressed by factors outside anyone's control. It was also more demanding than what they'd been doing, and demanded more from both of them, not just Victoria. He'd need to be there twice a day, 7 a.m. and 5 p.m., which meant reorganizing his cleaning shift hours, which meant a conversation with Gerald and facilities management that he wasn't looking forward to. He had the conversation the next day. Gerald, characteristically, said nothing for a long moment and then said, You doing what I think you're doing up there? Probably, Ethan said. Her board's trying to take the company. I know. Gerald looked at him with the expression of a man who had seen enough of the world to know that some choices are made long before they're announced. Make sure she knows what she's getting into, he said. People in hard situations sometimes make the helper responsible for the outcome. I know that too, Ethan said. Gerald nodded slowly and went back to his equipment, and that was the end of the conversation. The next 2 weeks were different from the first 2 in a way that was hard to articulate cleanly. The first 2 weeks had been about waking something up. These were about making it work under pressure, and the distinction was everything. Victoria trained in the mornings and the evenings, and she was not graceful about it. She didn't pretend it wasn't hard. She grunted through the resistance work, said, "That's enough," sometimes, and then kept going when Ethan said they weren't done. Occasionally lost her temper at her own body in brief, controlled bursts of frustration that she didn't apologize for and he didn't ask her to. She'd grip the parallel bars until her knuckles went white and push through an extension hold that had her shaking and say absolutely nothing about any of it, and then the next morning she'd be there at 7 again. He adjusted and readjusted the program as the data changed. The right side nerve response went from intermittent to reliable around the end of week 3, which was earlier than he'd projected and which he told her without dramatics. She received this the same way she received everything, with a sharp nod and then immediate inquiry about what it meant for the next stage. What it meant was standing work. Actual load bearing, with support, weight distributed through a nervous system that was arguing loudly against the whole project. The first time she stood, both feet on the floor, both legs bearing partial load, his hands at her hips and her hands white-knuckled on the bars, she lasted about 4 seconds before her legs gave out and he caught her. She swore, once, colorfully. 4 seconds, he said. That's nothing. That's 4 seconds more than 8 months. He reset his position. Again. She looked at him. She was sweating and breathing hard, and her hair was coming loose from its tie, and she looked, in that moment, less like a tech CEO and more like someone in the middle of something real. Again, she said. Bam. What he hadn't expected, though maybe he should have, was how the weeks would change the texture of the mornings. The sessions had started as a formal arrangement. He came, they worked, he left. Clean lines. But 45 days of appearing at someone's door at 7 a.m. does something to the formality, whether you intend it or not. He knew that she took her coffee black and that she was useless until she'd had at least half of it. He knew that her mood on any given morning correlated more strongly with whatever had happened in her 7 a.m. emails than with anything that had happened the day before. He knew that she went cold and clipped when she was scared, that she got sarcastic when she was making progress she didn't want to let herself feel yet, and that when she was in real pain she got very quiet and very still, and he'd learned to recognize that specific stillness as the thing that meant slow down, not keep pushing. She knew things about him too, though he hadn't offered them intentionally. She knew about Noah. He mentioned Noah naturally, the way you mention the central fact of your life without thinking about whether you're revealing something, and she'd asked a few questions and listened to the answers without performing interest. She knew about the appeal and its current status, which he'd updated her on when she'd asked directly. She knew that he took the overnight cleaning shift because it let him be home when Noah got up in the mornings, and that he'd been doing this calculation, what the job costs versus what it gives, for 16 months without a clean resolution. One evening, after the 5 p.m. session, she said, "What's the appeal status?" "Same as last week." "That's not good enough. Who's handling it?" "A veterans advocacy organization. They have a backlog." She looked at him with an expression that he was starting to recognize as the look she got when she was about to do something helpful that she wasn't going to ask permission for. "I have 3 employment attorneys in my general counsel's network who have handled military administrative cases. I'd like to make an introduction." He was quiet for a moment. "Victoria." "I'm not doing it because I feel sorry for you," she said, using his own line back at him with the flat precision of someone who'd been waiting to use it. "I'm doing it because you're good at your job and you got cut for being right, and the appeal is sitting in a queue because nobody with resources has looked at it. I have resources. That's a fixable problem." He looked at her for a long moment. He had a complicated relationship with accepting things. It was one of the reasons Claire had left, she'd said, the way he made himself difficult to help, the way he turned assistance into a referendum on whether he deserved it. "Thank you," he said. She nodded. "I'll have my assistant send you the contact." She went back to the laptop. He gathered his equipment, and somewhere in the ordinary mechanics of that exchange, the offer made without ceremony, the acceptance without ceremony, the return to work, something shifted in the arrangement that neither of them named. Outside the windows, the city did what it always did, which was continue. Inside, the standing record was up to 40 seconds and climbing. The standing record hit 90 seconds on a Tuesday morning, 5 weeks into the program, and Victoria didn't celebrate it. She counted it under her breath, hit the number, and then lowered herself back into the wheelchair with controlled precision and said, "Same time tomorrow." And that was that. Ethan wrote it in his notebook. 90 seconds, bilateral load-bearing, minimal lateral drift. He didn't make a speech about it either. They'd developed a shared language around progress that was almost entirely practical. Numbers, observations, adjustments. And it worked because it kept the emotional weight off the daily increments and saved it for the actual milestones. They both knew, without discussing it, that 90 seconds was not the milestone. The milestone was the board meeting. Everything until then was infrastructure. What he hadn't anticipated was the phone call that came on a Wednesday, 3 days later, while he was in the middle of the morning session. Victoria's phone was face up on the side table. She kept it visible during sessions in case something urgent came through from her assistant or her general counsel. She'd silenced it, but not turned it over, which meant she could see the screen from where she was working. She was in the middle of a supported lateral step sequence. Her best work yet, 4 consecutive steps with the walker before the left knee buckled, when the screen lit up with a name that made her stop moving entirely. Ethan caught her before the buckle became a fall. "Stay with me. What happened?" She didn't answer right away. She was looking at the phone with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Not the controlled bitterness she used for board politics. Not the clipped frustration she used for physical setbacks. Something rawer than that. "That's Richard Cho," she said. "He's my co-founder." Ethan waited. "He's also the one who put together the vote." She said it quietly, with a flatness that contained the particular kind of hurt that comes not from enemies, but from people who were supposed to be something else. "We built Hale Technologies together. 9 years. He recruited 3 of the board members I'm currently fighting." The phone stopped ringing. She looked at it for another second, then turned away from it and repositioned her hands on the walker. "I don't want to talk about it," she said. "Okay. Keep going." He kept going. But the lateral steps that followed were different. Not worse, technically, but compressed, like she was moving through something denser than air. He noted it and said nothing. Richard Cho had called back twice more by the end of the morning session, and when Ethan left at 8:30, he passed her in the process of calling Cho back, her voice already calibrated to the register she used when she was maintaining control of something that was trying to get away from her. He didn't hear what was said. He rode the elevator down, picked up Noah from the morning school bus, made breakfast, and tried not to think about the expression on her face when she'd seen that name on the screen. He thought about it anyway. He'd seen that expression before, worn differently, but structurally the same, on the faces of soldiers who'd come back from injury to find that the thing they'd been fighting to return to had quietly rearranged itself in their absence. The betrayal wasn't just the board vote, it was the specific mathematics of who was behind it. The person who knew exactly how she thought, exactly what she'd built, and how she'd built it, and had chosen to use that knowledge to dismantle rather than defend. That kind of damage didn't stay compartmentalized. It leaked into the mornings and the sessions and the 40 seconds of standing work. And the thing about physical rehabilitation was that the nervous system and the emotional system were not as separate as medical taxonomy made them sound. He'd seen patients lose 2 weeks of progress to a single piece of news that hit them the wrong way. He'd seen it in Marcus Webb, whose ex-wife had filed for divorce during his recovery and whose neural responses had gone flat for 10 days before Ethan had understood what was happening. He texted Victoria at noon. He kept it short. "Morning session at 7 tomorrow. Bring the hard days, but they're the ones that count." She didn't respond until late afternoon. 2 words. "I know." He took that as enough. The next morning she was at the door at 7 exactly, and she looked like someone who'd had approximately 4 hours of sleep and had made peace with that fact before he arrived. "How bad?" he said. "He's offering me a settlement," she said. "Step down voluntarily, retain a ceremonial advisory title, keep a minority equity stake. In exchange for not contesting the vote." She moved the wheelchair to the center of the room where the mat and the walker were already set up. His attorneys drafted it. He delivered it personally, which I think he thought would make it more palatable. Did it. It made me want to throw the phone out the window. She positioned herself at the walker. "I didn't, because it's a good phone. But I thought about it." Ethan checked the position of the walker, adjusted it 2 centimeters. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd think about it." He looked at her. "Did you mean that?" "No. She gripped the handles. I told him I'd think about it because telling him no immediately would have started a conversation I wasn't prepared to have at 10 o'clock at night. But no. She took a breath. I built that company. I wrote the first line of code that became the core architecture. I hired the first 12 employees. I was there every day for 9 years, and I'm supposed to step back and accept an advisory title while Richard runs it into something I don't recognize. She paused. No. Then we have work to do, he said. We do. She steadied herself on the walker. I told my general counsel this morning to send Cho's attorneys a formal declination, so the vote is happening regardless. Ethan straightened. How long? 12 days. He did the math. 5 weeks of accelerated work had gotten them to 90-second standing, 4 lateral steps, and a nerve response on both sides that was now consistent enough to build on. 12 days was not enough time to get her walking unassisted. He knew that. She knew that. But walking unassisted wasn't the only question on the table. Tell me what you actually need to be able to do in that room, he said. She looked at him. Walk in, not roll in. Stand at my own place at the table for the duration of a meeting. She paused. I don't need to run a marathon. I need to walk through a door and stand up long enough to make an argument. He thought about it. How far from the elevator to the boardroom? 40 feet, maybe 45. There's a corridor that turns left before the entrance. What's the floor surface? Polished concrete, same as up here. He nodded slowly, running the actual numbers. 45 feet was not 90 seconds of standing. It was movement, sustained, directed, load-bearing movement with a walker, on a surface that didn't allow for grip. It was a different calculation than what they'd been building. Harder in some ways, easier in others. 12 days, he said again. 12 days, she confirmed. Tell me it's possible. He was quiet for a long moment. He thought about the 14 things that could go wrong. He thought about the nerve response on her right side, which was reliable now but not strong, and what reliable but not strong meant when you put 45 feet of forward motion on top of it. He thought about what her left knee had done yesterday and what it would need to do differently before it was ready for sustained unassisted load. I think it's possible, he said. I don't know, but I think it's possible. That's enough, she said. Let's start. The next 12 days had a quality that neither of them would have been able to fully describe to someone who hadn't been inside them. They were not inspirational in the clean, cinematic sense. They were grinding and repetitive and frequently demoralizing, and Victoria's body did not cooperate on any kind of consistent schedule. Day 8 was the worst. She'd come into the morning session already tight, having spent 2 hours on a call with her legal team going through the governance procedure the board was using to run the vote, and the tension she was carrying had settled into her lower back and hips in a way that made the nerve response patchy and uneven. She lasted 11 steps before her left knee gave out, and when Ethan caught her, she pushed him away before he'd fully stabilized her and nearly went down again. Stop, she said. You're not steady. I said stop. She grabbed the walker herself, knuckles white. Give me a minute. He gave her a minute. She stood there, both hands on the walker, head down, breathing. He stood close enough to catch her and far enough to give her the space she'd asked for. He could hear her breathing regulate, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the pattern he'd taught her for pain management in week 2. When she looked up, her eyes were wet. She didn't do anything about that. Didn't look away, didn't apologize. She just let it be there. I don't know if I can do this, she said. He didn't say, yes, you can. He didn't say, don't give up. He'd learned over years of this work that those responses were for the person offering them, not the person receiving them. Which part? He said. Any of it. Her voice was flat. The walk? The meeting? Watching them sit there and judge whether I'm capable based on whether I can manage 45 feet without falling over. She paused. Richard is going to be in that room. He's going to sit at that table and watch me walk in, and he's going to... She stopped. I built that company. I gave it everything I had. And now I have to prove to him in a room full of people he convinced that I deserve to keep what's already mine. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said. You do. She looked at him. That's not fair, he said. It's not right. It's a specific kind of terrible that you have to prove yourself in a room where the verdict was already written before you walked in. I'm not going to tell you it isn't." He paused. "But the question isn't whether it's fair. The question is whether you're going to let them write the ending." She looked at him for a long moment. The wet in her eyes didn't spill. It just stayed there, evidence of the weight of this that she wasn't going to perform away. "No," she said. "Then we're not done today." She took a breath. She repositioned her hands on the walker. "Count me off," she said. He counted her off. Day 9, she walked 18 steps before she needed to rest. Day 10, 23 steps, and she didn't need Ethan's hands at her hips at all. Just the walker, just her own weight, and the nerve pathways that had been dormant for 9 months, and were now, grudgingly and painfully, answering. He didn't tell her it was 23 steps until after she'd sat down. When he told her, she looked at him with an expression that wasn't quite disbelief and wasn't quite joy. Something in between, something more cautious than either, like a person who has been disappointed by numbers before and is not ready to let numbers mean something again yet. "That's almost halfway," she said. "Yes." 2 days ago, I couldn't manage 11. "Yes." She looked at her hands on the wheels of the chair. "Why did it jump like that?" "Because your nervous system finally stopped fighting the protocol," he said. "It happened earlier with Marcus Webb, too. There's a point in the recovery where the system goes from resisting the reactivation to cooperating with it. It's like," he searched for the right comparison. "You know when you're trying to push open a door you think is locked, and you lean all your weight into it, and then it turns out it wasn't locked and you almost fall?" "Yes." "It's like that, but in reverse. You've been pushing against the resistance for 6 weeks. The resistance finally moved." She was quiet for a moment. "It's going to hurt tomorrow, isn't it?" "Probably." "Will it hurt less by the meeting?" "Managed differently, not less." She nodded. She looked back out at the city. It was early November now, and the light through the windows had changed, harder and thinner than it had been in September when he'd first come to this floor. The city below sharp-edged and bright the way cities got when the warmth finally left the air. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "Did you ever not believe it was going to work, for me specifically?" She turned back. "Not the professional assessment. I mean, did you ever come in here and think, maybe this is the one I'm wrong about?" He thought about answering the diplomatic way, and then thought about how she'd told him the first week not to soften things. 3 days after we started," he said, "your right side wasn't responding the way I expected, and I went home and ran the numbers again, and for about 2 hours I thought I'd misread the initial assessment." He paused. "And then I ran them again and I saw what I'd missed, the lateralization pattern, and I knew I hadn't misread it. But those 2 hours were real." She studied him. "What did you do with them?" "I sat at my kitchen table and stared at my notes until I found the thing I'd missed." He shrugged slightly. "That's the job. You don't get to have the 2 hours of doubt and then give up. You have them, and then you go back to the notes." "Noah was asleep." "Noah was asleep," he confirmed. She looked at him for a moment longer, and something in her expression shifted in a way that was hard to describe, like a door opening very slightly in a room that had been sealed for a long time. "Thank you for telling me that," she said. "The honest version. That's the only version I have." The meeting was in 2 days. The day before, Ethan arrived at 7 to find that Victoria had already run through the warm-up sequence on her own. He could tell by the position of the equipment and the sheen of exertion on her face when she opened the door. She'd been up since 5. He knew because she'd emailed him at 5:14 a.m. with a question about ankle stabilization during forward ambulation that was so technically precise he'd had to read it twice to parse it. "You've been working already," he said. "I couldn't sleep." "Victoria, I know. Rest before performance. You've said it 4 times. She positioned herself at the walker. "I also know that lying in bed at 4 a.m. running worst-case scenarios through my head wasn't rest. So I figured the warm-up sequence was a better use of the anxiety." He couldn't argue with the logic. "How does the left knee feel?" "Stiff. It loosened up after the first 10 minutes. We'll do 15 minutes of prep work before we do the full run." He looked at her. I want to do the walk today, the actual distance, 45 feet. She met his eyes. You think I'm ready? I think we need to know if you are before tomorrow morning. She nodded. Okay. He'd measured 45 feet in the main corridor of the penthouse, from the elevator lobby entrance to the far wall, which was close enough to the actual boardroom distance to function as a proxy. He'd marked it with two small pieces of tape, which Victoria had allowed without comment. The prep work took 17 minutes because her left ankle needed extra attention. He worked it carefully, watching her face for the quality of pain that meant stop versus the quality that meant keep going. She gave him the information he needed without exaggerating or minimizing, which was one of the things he'd come to rely on. Her precision extended to her own body in a way that made her a better patient than almost anyone he'd worked with. At the end of the prep work, she positioned herself at the walker. He stood 2 feet to her left and slightly behind, close enough to catch her if the left knee buckled, far enough not to be a crutch. The hallway stretched ahead of them, 45 feet of polished concrete, 2 pieces of tape at the far end. Whenever you're ready, he said. She took a breath. She looked at the end of the corridor, and she started. The first 15 feet were the best. Her rhythm was consistent, weight transfer clean, left knee holding. He watched her mechanics with the focused attention of someone who has spent 2 months learning exactly how this particular body moved and exactly where it was likely to fail. He saw the right side hesitate at foot 17, saw her compensate with the walker, saw the compensation work. Foot 23 was where the left knee started to argue. He saw it in the set of her jaw before he saw it in the mechanics. That specific compression of her expression that meant she was managing pain she hadn't asked for. She didn't slow down. She adjusted the weight distribution slightly and kept moving. 30 feet, 35. Her breathing was audible now, controlled but effortful. At 40 feet, her left knee buckled. He caught her, his hands at her hips the instant the drop started, his weight back and braced, the catch smooth from weeks of practice. She grabbed the walker and held, not down, not falling, just stopped, 5 feet short. She stood there, breathing hard, both hands white on the walker. He didn't say anything. After a long moment, she said, "Again." "Victoria, again." Her voice was quiet but absolute. "I'm not stopping at 40 feet. He looked at her. Her hair was damp at the temples. There was a tremor in her left hand that wasn't there this morning. She was exhausted and in pain, and she was looking at him with an expression that left no room for discussion. "Take 2 minutes," he said. "Breathe. Redistribute the weight. Then we go again." She nodded. 2 minutes. She breathed. He watched her work through it. Not the breathing he'd taught her, not any technique, just the raw private process of a person deciding that the next 5 feet are worth the cost of them. "Ready?" she said. He stepped back into position. She pushed off. 1 step, 2, 3. The left knee held. Not easily. He could see the effort it was taking, but it held. 4 steps. She was at the tape. She stopped. She stood there at 45 feet, both hands on the walker, chest heaving, and she didn't say anything for a long moment. He didn't either. "Okay," she said finally. Her voice was different, not soft exactly, but the hard edge that was usually in it had been worked down to something else. Something that had come through the other side of something and wasn't quite sure yet what it had found there. "Okay." 45 feet, he said. "With a walker." "With a walker," he confirmed. "Same as tomorrow." She turned around, slowly, carefully, the walker pivoting with her, and looked back at the length of the corridor they'd covered. 45 feet. The elevator lobby at one end, the tape at the other. The city outside the windows doing its indifferent, continuous thing. "I need to call my general counsel," she said. "Tell her I'll be there in person." "Do that," he said. She wheeled back toward the living space. At the edge of the corridor, she stopped and turned slightly, not fully facing him. "Ethan," she paused. "I know I'm difficult." "Sometimes," he said. I know it's been more complicated than you probably expected when you knocked on my door. Most things worth doing are." She was quiet for a moment. He could see her deciding whether to say the next thing, whatever it was. She decided against it, and he let that be fine. 7 tomorrow morning, she said. I'll be here. She went to make her call. He stood in the corridor for a moment. 45 feet of polished concrete, 2 small pieces of tape, the morning light coming through the windows at the angle that meant it was almost 8:30. He picked up the tape, folded it into both his notebook, and let himself out. In the elevator, he exhaled slowly and leaned against the wall and thought about tomorrow. He thought about 45 feet of boardroom corridor and a room full of people who had already made up their minds and a woman who was going to walk through the door anyway. He thought about what Gerald had said weeks ago. Make sure she knows what she's getting into. He thought that the inverse was also true, that you had to know what you were getting into when you made a promise to someone who had nothing left to lose. Because the people with nothing left to lose were the ones who went all the way to the end, and going all the way to the end meant you had to be willing to go there with them. He was willing. The elevator doors opened onto the parking structure. He walked to his car in the thin November light, and he drove home to make breakfast for a 7-year-old who would want to know about the chrysalis. And he thought about tomorrow the whole way there. He was there at 6:30. He hadn't planned on 6:30. He'd told her 7. She'd told him 7. And 7 was the established time. But he woke up at 5 and lay in the dark staring at the ceiling for 40 minutes, and then got up and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with his notebook and the accumulated data of 7 weeks. And somewhere around 6, he accepted that he wasn't going to do anything useful at home and drove to the building. Victoria was already awake. She answered the door in the same practical athletic clothes she always wore for their sessions, and she looked at him for a moment without surprise. 6:30, she said. I was in the neighborhood. You live in Meridian. I drove through the neighborhood. He came inside. How did you sleep? I didn't. At all. 2 hours, maybe 3. I gave up around 4. She moved the wheelchair toward the kitchen. Coffee's made. It's the good kind, not the protein shakes. He sat at the kitchen counter he'd never sat at before. In 7 weeks of morning sessions, he'd always gone straight to work, and she'd always already had coffee by the time he arrived, and they'd never sat in the kitchen together like 2 ordinary people at 6:30 in the morning. The unfamiliarity of it was noticeable in a way that was hard to pin down. Not uncomfortable, just new. Another edge of formality worn away. She poured 2 cups and set one in front of him. Black, no prompt required. She'd seen how he took it. Tell me what you're thinking, she said. I'm thinking about your left knee, he said honestly, and the floor surface, and whether the lighting in the boardroom corridor is even or whether there are glare patches from the windows. There are glare patches, 3 of them, about halfway down. We'll move through them without slowing down. Slowing down is harder on the knee than steady pace. She wrapped both hands around her cup. Is there anything we haven't covered? He thought about it. Your posture under stress. When you're talking and standing at the same time, you're going to want to put extra weight on the walker and lean forward slightly. Don't. Keep your weight centered. Leaning shifts the load distribution and the left knee won't hold as well. Centered? Okay. And look at whoever you're talking to. Not at the floor, not at the walker. Look at the people. She looked at him. I know how to run a meeting. You know how to run a meeting from a chair, he said. Standing is different. Your instinct is going to be to manage the physical experience and let the presentation run on autopilot. Don't. The physical experience needs to run on autopilot, and you need to be present for the room. She was quiet for a moment, processing the distinction. That's harder than it sounds. I know. That's why I'm saying it now instead of in there. She drank her coffee. He drank his. The city outside the kitchen windows was still pre-dawn gray. The lights of the skyline doing their indifferent thing, the building below them already filling with people who had no idea what was happening on the 52nd floor. Richard will be there early, she said. He's always early. It's a thing he does. He gets there before everyone else and arranges himself at the table so that whoever comes in after has to walk past him. Let him. I know. She set her cup down. I'm not afraid of him. I know you're not. She stopped, reworked whatever she'd been about to say. I'm angry. I've been angry for 4 months and I've been using it as fuel, and this morning I don't want it to be fuel anymore. I want to be past it. She looked at the window. I'm not sure I know how to walk into that room angry and also walk out of it having said everything I need to say without the anger doing the talking for me. He thought about this carefully. What do you actually want to say to them? That I built this company, that I was there before any of them were. That my ability to lead has nothing to do with whether I'm standing or sitting. That if Richard Cho thinks he can take something from me that I bled for 9 years to build, he has fundamentally misunderstood who I am. She paused. That's the anger talking. That's also the truth, though. Yes, but truth delivered in anger sounds like desperation. I need it to sound like fact. She turned back to face him. How do you separate them? You don't entirely, but the standing helps. Not symbolically, actually physiologically. You're going to be working hard to manage the walk and the pain and the posture. That effort uses the same neurological bandwidth that the anger runs on. You'll be present and controlled not because you talked yourself into it, but because your body won't have the surplus to sustain the anger on top of everything else it's doing. He paused. I've seen it before. The physical demand becomes a kind of focus. She studied him. You're describing using the pain strategically. I'm describing the fact that it's going to be there anyway. Might as well let it work for you. She was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. You're strange, she said. You know that. I've been told. In a useful way. She picked her cup back up. That's a compliment. I took it as one. But the prep work started at 7 and ran longer than usual. He was thorough, more thorough than necessary maybe, but the left knee had been unpredictable, and he needed to know what it was going to do today before she put weight on it in front of 12 board members. He worked through the ankle, the knee, the hip, and watched the nerve response with the attention of someone who has spent 7 weeks learning to read a body the way other people read a room. The response was there. Both sides. Consistent. Good, he said, and he meant it without qualification. How good? As good as yesterday, maybe marginally better. He helped her to standing at the walker. Weight check. How does the left side feel right now? Solid. Stiff at the knee, but solid. Okay. He stood back. 10 steps. Slow and deliberate. She walked 10 steps. The left knee complained around step 7. He saw it, but it held. She walked back. Again, she said. You don't need again. I have what I need. I need it, she said. For me. He let her go again. 10 steps, 10 back. Cleaner the second time, less. The stiffness loosening as the tissue warmed. She stopped at the start position and stood for a moment, both hands on the walker, looking at nothing in particular. Okay, she said. The word had a different weight this time. Not tactical, settling. Okay, he said. She looked at him. Whatever happens in there, he said. You walked 45 feet yesterday. That's real. That's already done. They can't take that back. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once. The meeting was at 10. At 9:15, Victoria's assistant, a sharp-faced young woman named Dana, who had clearly been with Victoria long enough to be loyal beyond the salary, arrived at the penthouse to help her get ready. Ethan made himself scarce, moving to the building lobby to wait. He sat in one of the lobby chairs near the window, in his regular clothes, watching the people come and go. He'd been in this building for 4 months as a member of the cleaning crew and had been largely invisible to the people who moved through it. Now he sat in the lobby in civilian clothes and was simply a person waiting, and nobody looked at him differently, which confirmed something he'd already known about the architecture of how people got seen. At 9:48, his phone buzzed. Victoria. One line. Heading down. He stood. The elevator opened and she came out in the wheelchair, Dana beside her, both of them moving with the efficiency of people who had done the logistics of this 100 times. Victoria was dressed in a dark blazer and charcoal pants, hair down, the kind of put together that communicated authority without announcing that it was trying to. The walker was folded and hanging from the back of the wheelchair, positioned so it would be accessible but not visible as the first thing anyone saw. She looked at him when she came through the lobby, and he gave her a single nod. She gave him one back. The boardroom was on the 28th floor, which meant an elevator and then the walk from the elevator lobby to the conference room entrance, 43 feet, He'd measured it last week on the pretext of running a building maintenance check. He'd been thorough. Dana stopped outside the elevator bank. "I'll go up first," she said to Victoria. "Make sure the room's ready." Victoria nodded. Dana stepped into the elevator and the doors closed. They were alone in the lobby alcove. Victoria looked at the elevator call button. Ethan stood beside her, not in front of her, not behind her, just beside, the way he'd stood beside her through 7 weeks of mornings. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "When you came in that night, the night you found me on the floor," she paused, "I want you to know that that wasn't a regular night for me. It wasn't something I did a lot." She said this without looking at him, in the voice she used for things that were harder to say than they looked. "I had been going through a period where I'd been having a very bad month, and that night I was trying to get the photograph because I needed to remember that I used to—" She stopped again. "You don't have to explain it," he said. "I'm not explaining it. I want you to know that what you saw wasn't—" She stopped a third time and made a brief, frustrated sound. "I'm terrible at this." "At what?" "At saying thank you without it turning into something else." He looked at her. "Victoria, you don't owe me a particular kind of gratitude. You never did." He paused. "But for what it's worth, what I saw that night was someone who was having a terrible month and was still trying to do something about it. That's not a thing to be embarrassed about." She was quiet for a moment. The elevator light came on. Someone coming down from above. "After this," she said, "when it's done, I'd like to meet Noah." He hadn't expected that. He let it land for a second before he answered. "He's been asking about you." "What have you told him?" "That you're direct. That's different from mean." She almost smiled. Not quite. There was too much else happening in her face. But almost. "That's accurate." The elevator opened. They got in. The 28th floor of Hale Tower was different from the 52nd and different from the service corridors Ethan had been moving through for 4 months. It had the architecture of corporate authority, high ceilings, materials that cost more than they needed to, a particular silence that was engineered rather than natural. The kind of space designed to make the people inside it feel like the decisions made there had weight. Ethan stayed in the elevator lobby. This was as far as he went. He'd known that from the beginning, and it was right. This part was hers. Victoria came out of the wheelchair with the walker in one smooth sequence. Dana held the chair, Ethan's hands were at her hips for the transition, and then gone the moment she had the walker. And then she was standing, both hands gripping the handles, weight distributed, posture centered the way he'd told her. She looked down the corridor. 43 feet to the conference room entrance. 3 glare patches from the east-facing windows. 12 people on the other side of the door who had already written the ending of this story. She didn't look back at him. He didn't expect her to. This was the place where looking back cost something she needed to spend looking forward. She started walking. He watched from the elevator lobby, and he watched with the particular attention of someone who had earned the right to know exactly what they were looking at. He'd seen this walk in its component parts. The left knee holding, the right side managing, the weight transfer. But he hadn't seen it as a whole thing, moving through space with a destination and a purpose, and the whole thing was different from the parts. The whole thing was a person. She reached the glare patches at foot 22. She didn't slow down. The left knee held. At foot 38, she stopped. Not because she had to, but to adjust her grip and reset her breath, which was exactly the right call, and she'd made it herself without prompting. 3 seconds, then she kept moving. She reached the conference room entrance at foot 43. Dana, who had walked ahead, opened the door. Victoria walked through it. Ethan sat in the elevator lobby for the duration of the meeting, which was 1 hour and 17 minutes by his phone clock. He didn't pace. He sat in one of the lobby chairs and read through his notebook. Not the session notes, but the earlier pages. The ones from the first week when the data was thin and the questions were bigger than the answers. He read them not for information, but for the record of what this had been. How it had started. What it had cost. At one point, about 40 minutes in, Dana came out of the conference room and walked to the lobby and sat down in the chair across from him. She didn't say anything right away. She looked like someone who had been in high-stakes rooms for long enough to have a calibrated read on them. "She's standing," Dana said. He looked up. "The whole time. She hasn't sat down." Dana paused. Richard Cho came in late. He looked at her and didn't say anything for about 10 seconds. I don't think he was expecting... She paused again. I don't think any of them were expecting that. Ethan said nothing. She started talking and she sounded like herself, Dana said. The version of herself from before the accident, not performing it, just being it. She looked at him. Whatever you did, that's what it looked like. He looked back at his notebook. She did it, he said. I just showed her where the door was. Dana looked at him for a moment in the way that people look at someone who has said something they disagree with but don't have the standing to argue. Then she went back inside. The door opened at 11:23 and people started coming out. Ethan stood. Most of them walked past without looking at him. They were board members in suits, people moving through a building lobby on their way to the next thing on their calendars. And he was a man in regular clothes by the elevator, and the social contract of this floor made him invisible to them the same way it had made him invisible for 4 months. He'd stopped minding that a long time ago. Richard Cho came out third. He was in his late 30s, fit, with the particular posture of someone who'd spent a long time being the smartest person in most rooms and had started leading with it. He glanced at Ethan with the brief assessment people like him gave to figures they didn't recognize, and then his gaze sharpened slightly. He paused. You're the janitor, Cho said. From the building directory. I work here, yes. Cho looked at him for a moment. Something moved through his expression. Calculation. And underneath it something less comfortable. He opened his mouth as if to say something, and then closed it, and then walked past. Ethan watched him go. Victoria came out last, with Dana beside her in the walker, and when Ethan saw her face, he knew. Not because she was smiling. She wasn't. Not exactly. But there was something in the set of her jaw and the angle of her shoulders that had been missing for the entire time he'd known her, or missing in this particular combination. Something that looked like someone standing on ground that belonged to them. She walked the 43 feet back to the elevator lobby without stopping. When she reached him, she stood for a moment, both hands still on the walker, breathing managed, posture centered, and looked at him. The vote was canceled, she said. He let the words settle. What happened? I walked in. I stood at my place at the table and I talked for 22 minutes, and I didn't sit down. She paused. I told them what I built and how I built it, and why the fact that I built it from a wheelchair for 9 months doesn't change what it is or what I'm capable of. She paused again. And I told them about you. He hadn't expected that either. What did you tell them? That the person who made this possible was a man this building paid to clean its floors, who nobody in this building had looked at twice, and that the gap between what someone appears to be and what they actually are is the most expensive mistake an organization can make. She met his eyes. I told them that if this company's leadership couldn't see the value in someone because of the uniform he wore, then we had a much bigger problem than my disability. He was quiet for a long moment. 3 of the board members have already reached out to my general counsel's office since the meeting ended, she said, formally withdrawing their support for the removal motion. Her voice was steady. The other 2 will follow. Richard will fall in line because the alternative is a legal challenge he won't win. She paused. It's done. He exhaled. Not a performance, just the actual release of a breath he'd been holding in some form since the morning. You stood for the whole thing, he said. The whole thing. How does the left knee feel? She looked at him. Of all the things he could have said in that moment, she'd apparently not expected that one. And something about it broke the controlled surface of her expression in a way that made her look briefly, entirely human. It hurts, she said. Good. He held out his arm. Means it worked. She took his arm, not leaning on it, just taking it, the way people do when they've been through something together and the something is finished and the fact of the other person is suddenly just a fact rather than a function. They walked to the elevator like that. Dana followed at a discreet distance, doing the thing good assistants do, which is understand when a moment is not about them. In the elevator, going up, Victoria looked at the numbers changing on the display. I need to call my legal team, she said, and my product leads. And there are about 40 emails I've been putting off sending for 3 days. She paused. After that, I'm going to sit down for approximately 8 hours and not stand up again today. That's medically advisable, he said. And then tomorrow, she stopped. Tomorrow we do the morning session, he said. 6 weeks of work to maintain and build on. We're not done. She looked at him. I know. Something in her voice was different now. Not lighter exactly, but less armored, like a room after the windows have been opened. I know we're not done. The elevator opened on the 52nd floor. Dana tactfully took the walker and gave Victoria the option of the chair for the corridor, and Victoria took it without the particular tension that had always accompanied that choice. It was just a chair. It was just a corridor. The meaning of the objects had shifted without either of them announcing that it had. Ethan helped with the transfer at the door and then stood in the corridor while she and Dana went inside to begin the work of reclaiming a company. He stood there for a moment in the quiet of the 52nd floor, the hum of the HVAC, the distant city, the same corridor he'd mopped 3 nights a week for 4 months. He thought about a mop bucket and a clipboard and a crash from behind a door he hadn't been invited to open. He thought about 45 feet of polished concrete and 2 pieces of tape, and a woman who had walked there and back and decided she wasn't done yet. His phone buzzed. It was his employment attorney, one of the 3 Victoria had connected him with 6 weeks ago. He'd spoken to her twice, and she'd filed supplemental documentation last week. The text was 2 sentences long. Administrative Review Board has issued a preliminary ruling in your favor. Reinstatement proceedings beginning next month. He read it twice. He stood in the corridor of the 52nd floor of Hale Tower, and he read it twice and felt the particular weight of something that had been sitting on his chest for 16 months begin to lift in the particular way that real things lift. Not all at once, not cleanly, but in a way that was unmistakably real. He thought about Noah, who would be getting off the school bus in 4 hours. He thought about what he was going to say. He put his phone in his pocket and looked at the door of the penthouse. Closed now, Victoria on the other side of it, doing the 100 things that needed doing. He thought about the conversation they needed to have soon, the one that wasn't about physical therapy or nerve response or board meetings, the one about what came next for both of them, now that the emergency was over and something else was beginning. He'd have it tonight, or tomorrow. There was time now, and time had been the thing in shortest supply for so long that the sudden presence of it felt almost unfamiliar. He pressed the elevator button. The doors opened and he got in. Going down, he thought, 43 feet. She walked 43 feet and changed the room. And the room would never quite be the same configuration again, because the person who walked through it had refused to be written out of her own story. And that refusal had a weight that 12 board members in expensive suits had not been equipped to absorb. He rode down through 28 floors and stepped out into the lobby and walked through the same door he'd walked through 4 months ago with a mop bucket and the kind of exhaustion that comes from going unnoticed for a long time. And he walked out into the November morning with a different kind of quiet inside him. Not the quiet of invisibility, but the quiet of a person who has done the thing he set out to do and is standing on the other side of it. The city was loud and cold and entirely indifferent, and he walked through it toward his car thinking about pancakes and a chrysalis and a 7-year-old who had been asking about a woman named Victoria and whether she was going to be okay. He pulled out his phone and typed a text to Noah's after-school caretaker. "Pick him up on time today. We're going somewhere tonight." He didn't specify where. He'd figure that out. He got in his car. He started the engine. He drove. The chrysalis hatched on a Thursday. Noah had given up checking it every morning sometime around week 3. The way children give up on things that don't deliver on the timeline they've decided is reasonable, and had moved on to a new interest involving the aerodynamics of paper airplanes. So it was Ethan who noticed it first, standing in the kitchen making coffee at 6 a.m., 2 days after the board meeting, glancing at the windowsill out of habit, and finding the jar empty and a small crumpled thing clinging to the inside of the lid, wings still wet and compressed, working to unfold. He stood there for a moment with the coffee pot in his hand. Then he went and woke Noah up. Noah came in barefoot and squinting, saw the jar, and went from half asleep to fully alert in the way that only children can manage, with no visible intermediate stage. He pressed his face close to the glass and watched the wings moving, slow, deliberate, like something remembering what it was, and didn't say anything for a long time. "Is it okay?" he finally asked. "Yeah," Ethan said. "It just needs time to dry out before it can fly." Noah watched it for another minute. "How does it know how to do that? It didn't exist before." Ethan thought about that for a moment. "It existed," he said. "It was just in a different form." Noah considered this with the thoroughness he applied to things that mattered. "Like when you were in the army, and now you're not," he said. Ethan looked at his son. 7 years old, bare feet on the kitchen floor, hair everywhere, making the kind of connection that adults spend years trying to articulate, and children arrive at in 60 seconds because they don't have enough preconceptions yet to block the view. "Yeah," Ethan said, "kind of like that." The morning session with Victoria was at 7, same as always. He arrived to find her already standing at the window, not in the wheelchair, not at the walker, just standing, one hand resting lightly on the windowsill for balance. She heard him come in and turned, and the turn was cautious, but it was a turn, weight shifting and recovering without the rigid bracing that had characterized every movement for the first 3 weeks. "You were standing without the walker," he said, "for about 2 minutes. She moved carefully toward the chair. "The balance goes if I close my eyes. And the left knee is still—" "That's 2 minutes unsupported," he said. 3 weeks ago you were on the floor." She sat down. "I know." She said it quietly, without the defensiveness that would have accompanied the same sentence 4 weeks ago. Some of that armor had come off in the aftermath of the board meeting. Not all of it, and he wasn't sure all of it ever would, but the top layer had gone, the part that had been performing strength rather than having it. "I know where we were." He set down his bag and looked at her properly. She looked tired. The 2 days since the meeting had clearly been operational rather than restful. The phone calls and the emails and the company she had to reassemble after 4 months of it being quietly dismantled. But underneath the tired, there was something that hadn't been there before. He'd been trying to find the right word for it for 2 days, and the word he kept coming back to was inhabited. She looked like someone who had moved back into themselves after a long time living in the hallway. "How's the company?" he asked. "Complicated." She pulled her hair back with the specific efficiency of someone who's done it 10,000 times and is thinking about something else. "Richard submitted his resignation yesterday." Ethan looked at her. "Did you expect that?" "I expected the legal situation to push him out within 3 months. I didn't expect him to go quietly in 48 hours. She paused. "He sent me an email. 3 sentences. Professionally appropriate and completely impersonal." She was quiet for a moment. 9 years, 3 sentences. He sat down across from her. "Are you okay?" "I don't know yet." She said it with the honesty she'd been gradually extending to him over the past weeks. The admission of not knowing, which for someone like her was a kind of vulnerability. "Part of me is relieved he's gone. Part of me is... I keep thinking about how he was the first person I called when we got the Series A funding. He drove to my apartment at 2 a.m. and we sat on my floor and planned the next 5 years of our lives." She looked at her hands. "I don't understand how someone becomes who he became. I've been trying to and I can't." You might not be able to," Ethan said. "Some things don't have an explanation that makes them make sense. They just happened." "That's not very satisfying." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She looked at him. "Did you figure out the thing with Claire? Why she left the way she did?" He was quiet for a moment. She'd never asked about Claire directly before. She'd known the outline, the way you know the outline of someone's life when you've been present in it daily for almost 2 months. But she'd kept the boundary until now. The fact that she'd crossed it felt like information about where they were. "I figured out part of it," he said. "She told me some of it, and I worked out the rest on my own. But there's a piece I never fully understood, and I think that's just the shape of it." He paused. "Some exits don't come with a complete explanation. You get the part they're willing to give you, and you build what you can with it." She absorbed this. "Does that bother you?" "It used to. Now it's the fact of it. What bothers me is Noah not having her present the way he should. That part doesn't stop." She nodded slowly. "He seems okay," she said, "from what you've described." "He's better than okay. He's the best person I know." He said it simply, without performance. But better than okay and has everything he deserves are two different things. The morning light was doing its thing through the windows, that particular November quality of light that was honest rather than flattering. It showed everything exactly as it was, and what it showed was two imperfect people sitting in a room that had seen a lot of hard mornings, neither of them pretending the hard mornings hadn't happened. "I want to talk to you about something," Victoria said. "After the session." "Okay." "It's a work thing, but it's not transactional. I want to be clear about that before I say it." "Say it whenever you're ready," he said. "Let's work first." Ta. The session ran 90 minutes. He pushed her further than he had before. Not to test the limit, but because the limit had moved and he needed her to know where it was now. She walked 30 feet unsupported at the 20-minute mark, held for 40, and then they spent an hour on strength work, hip extension, knee stabilization, the long patient rebuilding of the muscular infrastructure that supported the nerve pathways they'd spent weeks reactivating. She worked without complaint, which had been true since week 2. What had changed was the quality of the silence during hard passages. It used to be a controlled silence, the silence of someone refusing to give ground. Now it was just focused. The difference was small, and it was everything. At the end of the session, he sat down with his notebook and she sat across from him, cooling down, drinking water. "The left knee is going to need at least another 4 weeks of consistent work," he said. "The strength deficit is the issue. The nerve response is there. The muscle hasn't caught up yet. If you skip sessions, it sets back faster than it builds, so we can't have the kind of week where things come up and the work gets deprioritized." "The work doesn't get deprioritized," she said. "I know. I'm saying it for the record." "You say things for the record a lot." "Old habit from documentation. Say the thing out loud so there's no confusion about whether it was said." He looked at his notes. "Balance training starting next week. The unsupported standing is good, but the dynamic balance, moving without the walker, turning, handling uneven surfaces, that's the next stage, and it takes longer than the initial reactivation." "How much longer?" "Months, not weeks." He met her eyes. "You should know that. There's no version of this where you're fully ambulatory in 30 days. The progress is real and it's going to continue, but the timeline is long." "I know the timeline," she said. "I've known since week 2 that this wasn't going to be fast." She paused. "I'm okay with long. Long means it's actually happening, not that it was a trick." He nodded. He closed the notebook. "What did you want to tell me?" She straightened slightly. Not the boardroom posture, something less armored than that, but still collected. The posture of someone who has prepared something and is not sure how it will land. "I want to offer you a position," she said, "at Hale Technologies, Director of Employee Wellness and Rehabilitation Programs." She paused. "It doesn't exist yet. I'm creating it. The company has 412 employees and a wellness program that amounts to a gym membership reimbursement and a hotline that nobody calls. I've been watching this for 2 years and never prioritized fixing it because there was always something more urgent." She paused again. "There's never not going to be something more urgent. That's the nature of the work. So I've decided to fix it now, and I want you to build it." He looked at her. "Full salary, benefits, equity stake at standard director level, office space or remote, whichever you prefer. You'd have a budget and a mandate, and you'd report directly to me." She kept her voice even, factual. "The reinstatement to the Veterans Program is beginning next month. I know that. I'm not asking you to give that up. If the reinstatement comes through and you want to go back to that work full-time, that's your call. But that process could take another 6 months, and in the meantime—" "Victoria." He said her name, and she stopped. He was quiet for a moment, thinking about it honestly rather than responding from the first thing he felt. "Why this position?" "Because you're good at it." "I'm good at physical rehabilitation. A corporate wellness director is a different job. The core of it is the same. You assess what's actually there instead of what looks like it should be there, and then you build toward what's possible rather than what's expected." She looked at him steadily. "You did that for me. You could do it for a company." She paused. 400 people who spend 60 hours a week building something. They deserve someone who sees them the way you see patients, not as a liability to be managed, but as a resource to be supported. He was quiet. I'm also aware, she continued, that you've been cleaning floors for 16 months while you wait for a system to acknowledge something that should have been acknowledged in the first place, and that Noah deserves a father who isn't working the overnight shift. She said this carefully, not as pressure, but as information. I know you don't make decisions based on what you deserve. I'm appealing to Noah's interests, which I understand you weigh differently. He looked at her for a long moment. There was something almost funny about it. The precision with which she'd mapped the argument, had identified the angle most likely to reach him, and had used it without apology, because that was who she was. Direct, tactical, and underneath both of those things, genuinely trying. I need to think about it, he said. I know. She didn't push. Take the time you need. Can I ask you something first? Yes. Is this because you feel like you owe me something? She looked at him with the expression she got when she was being asked to account for something she'd already thought through. Partly, she said, and the honesty of it, the refusal to perform a cleaner motive, was one of the things he'd come to trust about her. I'm not going to pretend it isn't, but that's not the main reason. She paused. The main reason is that I watched you work for 2 months, and I know what you can do. And I think it would be a waste for someone with your ability to spend the rest of his career in an institution that fired him for being right. She met his eyes. That's the main reason. The debt is real, but it's separate. He nodded slowly. I'll think about it, he said again. Okay, she said. He picked Noah up from the after-school program at 4 and drove to the park 2 blocks from their apartment, the one with the good climbing structure that Noah had been navigating competitively since age 5. Noah climbed and Ethan sat on the bench and watched the November sky do its late afternoon thing and thought about a decision that was less complicated than it felt. It felt complicated because it was about more than the job. The job itself, director, salary, building something from nothing inside an organization that actually wanted it built. That part wasn't complicated. He knew how to do that work. He'd been doing versions of it for 10 years, and he'd been doing it in reduced form, in the margins of his actual life, for 16 months. What was complicated was the adjacency of it to Victoria, the fact that every morning would still bring him to the 52nd floor, that the professional relationship and whatever the other thing was would continue to operate in the same space, and that he'd have to figure out what to do with that other thing now that the emergency was over and the shape of it was less obvious. He was 32 years old. He hadn't been in a relationship since Claire, not really. A few dates in the first year after she left, when he'd still been trying to locate the version of himself that existed outside fatherhood and work. And then he'd stopped trying because the trying had felt dishonest. He wasn't good at the performance of courtship. He was good at being present, at paying attention, at doing the work that needed doing. That was a different set of skills. He didn't know what Victoria Hale was good at in that context. He knew what she was like at 7 in the morning when her back hurt and her emails were bad. He knew what she was like when she was scared and using precision as a proxy for control. He knew the shape of her stubbornness and the shape of her actual courage, which were different shapes. He knew more about her nervous system than most people knew about their closest friends. He didn't know if any of that mapped onto what came next, or whether it was its own thing that lived in the category of what had happened, complete in itself. Noah came down from the climbing structure and ran over. He was flushed and loose-limbed, the particular physical ease of a child who hasn't yet started holding tension in his body. He dropped onto the bench beside Ethan and breathed hard for a moment. Can we get the good tacos? He said. Yes. Can I meet Victoria sometime? Ethan looked at his son. She asked about you. Noah looked up. She did? She said she wanted to meet you. Noah thought about this. When? Soon. He paused. We're figuring some things out. But soon. Noah nodded, apparently satisfied. He was good at trusting Ethan soon. He'd had enough examples of it being true. They got the good tacos. On the drive home, Noah fell asleep in the back seat with half a taco still in his hand, the way children fall asleep, completely and without transition. And Ethan drove through the November dark and made the decision he'd already made somewhere in the park without fully acknowledging it. But he texted Victoria that night. I'll take the position. We should talk about the structure. She replied in 4 minutes. Agreed. Tomorrow after the session. Then, after a pause of about 30 seconds, also, thank you. He stared at that for a moment. She didn't say thank you easily. He knew that by now. You're welcome, he wrote. Then after his own pause, Noah wants to meet you. I told him soon. The reply came back quickly. I have Saturday free. Saturday arrived cold and clear, the kind of November day that was honest about being November. No pretense of residual warmth, just clean cold air and a low bright sun that made everything look sharp. Ethan drove Noah to the building at 10 in the morning, and Noah wore his good jacket without being asked, which meant he'd thought about it more than he'd let on. In the elevator, Noah looked at the numbers and said, She lives at the very top? The top floor, yeah. Does she own the whole building? She owns the floor. The building is a different thing. Noah considered this distinction. Do you think she has a good view? You'll see in about 40 seconds. Noah's expression when the elevator opened onto the 52nd floor was the expression of a 7-year-old encountering a scale of thing that didn't match his existing categories. He was quiet in the corridor, a significant departure from his usual running commentary. And when Victoria opened the door, he stopped and looked at her with the direct, assessing look of a child who doesn't yet know he's supposed to be more subtle about it. Victoria, to her credit, looked back at him the same way. Not performing warmth she didn't naturally have, not doing the exaggerated friendliness that adults sometimes deployed at children, as if children couldn't tell the difference, just looking at him honestly. You're Noah, she said. You're Victoria, he said. That's right. He nodded, apparently satisfied. My dad says you're direct. He says that's different from mean. Something moved through Victoria's expression. Ethan caught it from the side, a brief opening that she closed again quickly. He's right about that, she said. Come in. Noah went straight to the windows, which Ethan had expected. He stood there with his face about 6 inches from the glass and looked out at the city. All of it, the whole spread of it, and was quiet for a long time. You can see everything, he said. Most of it, Victoria said. She'd maneuvered the wheelchair to beside him, not making any particular point of it, just moving to where he was. On clear days you can see the water. Which direction? That way. She pointed east. Between those two buildings where the light looks different. Noah pressed his face closer. I can kind of see it. It takes a few minutes for your eyes to adjust to the distance. They stood there. Noah standing, Victoria in the wheelchair beside him, both of them looking east toward the place where the water was. And Ethan stood behind them and thought about the accumulated strangeness and rightness of this particular moment. Two people who had never been in the same room before, finding something to look at together, the city doing its indifferent thing below them, all of it somehow composed into something that felt like the beginning of a different kind of arrangement. He thought about the chrysalis on the windowsill. He thought about the 2 days it had taken the wings to dry and harden before it flew. He thought about how Noah had wanted to help it along, and Ethan had said no. You have to let it do that part on its own. That's the part that makes the wings strong enough to work. Some things you can't rush. You can create the conditions, and you can be present, and you can refuse to give up when the process is slow or painful, or looks from the outside like nothing is happening. But the essential work, the work of changing from one thing into another, that part happens in the dark and on its own schedule. And the most important thing anyone can do is not mistake the darkness for evidence that it isn't happening. But after Noah had exhausted the view and had been shown the kitchen, impressive, and the study, very impressive, and had asked approximately 40 questions that Victoria answered with the same directness she applied to everything, they ended up sitting at the kitchen counter with hot chocolate that Victoria's housekeeper had made, and Noah told Victoria about the chrysalis, and Victoria listened in the way she listened, fully, without performing it. It took a long time, Noah said. Things that are worth it usually do, she said. Noah thought about this. My dad says the important part happens when you can't see it. Victoria looked at Ethan across the counter. Something passed between them that wasn't a conversation yet, just the acknowledgement that one was eventually necessary, and that they were both clear-eyed enough to have it. Your dad is right, she said. That's the part that counts. Noah accepted this and went back to his hot chocolate, with the easy confidence of a child who has just had an adult confirm something his parent told him, which was all the validation he'd needed. After Noah fell asleep on the couch under a throw blanket, he'd crashed hard in the early afternoon, the way overstimulated children do. Ethan and Victoria sat on the living room floor with coffee, backs against the couch, the city outside doing its evening transition from light to lit. The decision about the job had been made, and they'd talked through the structure that morning after the session. Reporting lines, budget, timeline, the shape of the first 6 months. That was done. What wasn't done, and what both of them knew wasn't done, was the other conversation, the one that wasn't about the job or the physical therapy or the board. Victoria spoke first, which was how it usually worked. She had less tolerance for useful avoidance. "I need to say something," she said, "and I want to say it once and then have it be said." "Okay. What you did, what you've done these past 2 months, I want you to know that I'm aware of what it actually cost, not just the time and the sessions. The choice to show up when you didn't have to. The choice to tell me the truth when easier people would have managed me." She looked at her coffee. "I've been managed a lot, my whole career. People deciding what I can handle and editing the information accordingly. You never did that and I—" She paused. "I don't have a graceful way to say that it changed something. It just did." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Beside them, Noah shifted on the couch, resettled, went still. "Can I say something back?" Ethan said. "Yes. The night I found you on the floor, when you told me to leave and I didn't, that wasn't an act of charity. I want to be clear about that." He looked at the city through the windows. "I stayed because I saw someone who was still fighting, even on the floor, even reaching for a photograph at midnight, and I—" He paused, thinking about how to say the next part accurately. "I've spent 16 months being the person nobody was looking at, being useful in ways that were invisible. And when I saw you, I saw something I recognized, which was a person who was more than the situation they were in, and nobody in the building had thought to look closely enough to notice." He paused again. "I'm not saying I stayed because you reminded me of myself. I stayed because you were worth staying for. Those are different things." She was quiet for a long time. The city outside did its thing. Noah breathed on the couch. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah. I think we're probably going to have to be honest with each other about some things that are harder to be honest about than nerve response patterns." "I think so too." "Not tonight," she said. "There's too much else that just happened. But not much longer than tonight." "Whenever you're ready," he said. "That's the only way I know how to work." She looked at him. The almost smile was there again. The one that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent. The one he'd been seeing for 6 weeks and had stopped trying to name. "I know," she said. "That's one of the things." The weeks that followed had a different texture than the ones before the board meeting. More spacious, somehow, even though both their lives had gotten more complicated rather than less. Ethan started at Hale Technologies in an official capacity 3 weeks later, taking office space on the 14th floor and beginning the long work of building something from scratch inside an organization that had never had it. The morning sessions with Victoria continued, 7 a.m., but they were different now. The acute crisis had passed, and what was left was maintenance and growth, the less dramatic and more durable work of continuing. The reinstatement proceedings at the Veterans Program concluded in February. The Administrative Review Board ruled in Ethan's favor on all primary counts, and issued a formal finding that his termination had been procedurally improper. Dr. Ashford had retired the previous year. Ethan only found this out after the ruling from the attorney who'd handled his case, and he held that information for a while before deciding it didn't change anything about how he felt. The vindication wasn't about Ashford. It had stopped being about Ashford a long time ago. He was offered reinstatement at the federal program. He turned it down. The work he'd built with Victoria at Hale Technologies was real and growing, and more than that, it was his, built to his specifications, accountable to his values. He wrote to the attorney and asked her to convey his appreciation to the board, and then he went back to the work. Marcus Webb called him in March. Word had gotten around, it did, in that community, and Marcus wanted to know how Ethan had ended up at a tech company in the city. And Ethan told him the condensed version, and Marcus laughed and said, "You always did have a way of finding the people nobody else bothered to look at." Ethan thought about that for a while after the call ended. Noah met Victoria for the second time in December and the third time in January, and by February he was asking to go to the tall building with the ease of someone returning to a familiar place. He and Victoria had established their own particular dynamic, direct, honest, low on ceremony, that didn't require Ethan to translate or facilitate. She'd started asking him about the paper airplanes, and he'd started bringing her the best ones to test fly from the 52nd floor balcony, and Ethan watched this without comment because it was one of those things that was better experienced than explained. The conversation that Victoria had said couldn't wait much longer than the night of Noah's first visit happened on a Sunday in late November, on the rooftop of Hale Tower, where the maintenance crew had installed a small terrace that almost nobody used because almost nobody knew it was there. Ethan knew about it from 4 months of cleaning the building, and he'd gotten the key from Gerald, who had handed it over with the expression of a man who was far too wise to say what he was thinking. They'd gone up after the Sunday morning session, just the two of them, and stood at the railing and looked out at the city, and the conversation that happened wasn't dramatic. It wasn't clean. There were false starts and a long silence in the middle that might have been awkward with different people, and with them was just two people sitting with something real. What they said, in the aggregate, was this: that something had happened between them over the course of the last 3 months that was more than the roles they'd started in, that neither of them had been looking for it, and both of them had noticed it, that they were both imperfect and complicated, and had histories that would require ongoing navigation, that Ethan was not particularly skilled at the soft parts of things, and Victoria was not particularly skilled at the parts that required vulnerability, and both of them were aware of these deficits and willing to work on them because the alternative was walking away from something that felt irreplaceable, and neither of them was inclined to walk away from irreplaceable things. It wasn't a declaration. It was more like a mutual acknowledgement of a fact that had already established itself, and an agreement to be careful with it. They stood on the rooftop for an hour. The city was November cold and indifferent and enormous below them, and they stood in it together. And when Victoria moved from the railing, she didn't reach for the walker. She reached for the railing with one hand and shifted her weight and took 2 careful steps on her own before accepting his arm. And the 2 steps were completely unremarkable and utterly significant, and neither of them said anything about them at all. There is a thing that happens to people who are overlooked for a long time, a particular contraction that sets in, a narrowing of what they believe is possible for them. Not bitterness, exactly. More like an accommodation, an adjustment to the ceiling that someone else built over their life. They start moving more carefully, taking up less space, measuring out their hope in smaller units so that when it doesn't arrive, it costs less. And after a while, the accommodation becomes invisible even to themselves, and they stop remembering that the ceiling was ever installed by someone else rather than built into the structure of things. Ethan Cross had been doing that. Not all the way. Not so far that he'd lost the essential thing, the instinct to see what was actually there rather than what was supposed to be there, but far enough that he'd stopped asking what might still be possible and had started asking only what could be maintained. And there is a significant difference between those two questions, and the difference has a cost, and the cost is mostly invisible until something changes. Victoria Hale had been doing it too, differently and in different circumstances, but the same fundamental act, taking the ceiling that the accident had installed and the board had reinforced and one person's betrayal had hammered in, and beginning to treat it as a permanent feature of the room rather than something that had been put there by other people for their own reasons. The story of what happened between them, between the night he found her on the floor and the morning on the rooftop, is not really a story about recovery. It's not about a woman learning to walk again or a man getting his career back. Those things happened, and they matter, but they're the visible surface of the actual story, which is about what happens when two people who have been contracting suddenly stop contracting at the same time and in the same direction. The contraction reverses, the ceiling lifts, and what becomes visible, what was always there, underneath the accommodation and the careful management of hope, is that neither of them had actually given up on what they deserved. They'd just been waiting in their different ways for someone to show up who could see the whole picture. Not the picture of who they were supposed to be, or who they'd been before things got hard, or who they might become in some idealized future. Just the picture of who they actually were, right now, at this specific moment, imperfect and tired and still fighting, and say, that's worth something. That's worth a great deal. The people who change your life are rarely the ones you see coming. They're usually the ones you walk past every day without noticing. The person with the mop bucket, the woman in the wheelchair, the colleague who's been quiet in the back of the room while everyone talked around them. They're the ones who exist in the gaps of your attention, in the spaces you haven't thought to look because you've been so focused on the things that already have your focus. And then something happens. A crash behind a door, a photograph on a floor, a voice in the dark saying, "I'm going to help you." And you look up. And what you find there is not what you expected. It is usually more complicated and less finished and more entirely real. On a Tuesday morning in March, Ethan Cross arrived at the 52nd floor at 7 a.m. with a backpack and a notebook, the same as he had for 5 months, and Victoria Hale opened the door before he knocked, the same as she had for most of those months. And they worked for 90 minutes and argued about the pace of the balance training and solved nothing definitively, and scheduled the same argument for Thursday. And Noah, who was 7 years old and had a paper airplane in his backpack and a chrysalis story he was planning to tell his class, ate breakfast before school and told Ethan to say hi to Victoria. Ethan said he would. He took the elevator up through 52 floors of the city's vertical ambition, and the door opened, and he went to work. That was not the end of the story. It was somewhere in the long middle of it, where most of life actually happens. Not in the climax or the crisis, but in the ordinary Tuesday mornings after, when you show up for the things you've decided are worth showing up for, again and again, without ceremony, because that is what it means to have decided. That is what it means to have decided.